Welcome to another episode of the Tom Schimmer Podcast. Happy Monday, everyone. And happy last day of August. I'm not sure if I want to say it that way, but 1 week from today is Labor Day, which means 1 week from tomorrow is when everyone will finally be back to work. And I know some of you have been back to work already for a month, for a few weeks, but by next Tuesday, everyone will be back to work and summer will be officially over. We love our summer vacations and we love our jobs. And I know so many of you are craving a return to routine. If you have young children, I know at some point during the summer, the lack of routine kind of wore on them. It wore on you. And it's always nice for families to get back to those routines we become so dependent upon. Last week, I was in Green Bay, Wisconsin for a few days. This past weekend was my fantasy football draft. So I'm really excited about the fantasy football season coming up. Get that cranked up again. And I'll be headed for Southern California toward the end of this week. A few reminders as we get going today, of course. The Grading from the Inside Out 2-day training will be in Long Beach, California, September 21st and 22nd. Also be in Minneapolis, Minnesota, December 1st and 2nd. All of the information for those events can be found on the Solution Tree website. Of course, there are links in the show notes for those events as well. The other conference, of course, this fall I've been mentioning is the Teach Better Conference. That'll be in Akron, Ohio, October 14th and 15th. Great speakers lined up for that as well. Of course, the podcast is part of the Teach Better Network. And if you use the code SHIMMER22, you'll get a $25 discount on your registration. Links in the show notes for that event also. Okay, thanks for tuning in again this week. A big welcome to any new listeners joining in for the first time. And of course, a big thank you to longtime listeners. I really do appreciate all of you. This week, my guest is Lindsay Titus. Lindsay is an assistant principal, and she is the host of the Define YOUniversity podcast. And you is spelled Y-O-U. So it's the Define YOUniversity podcast. And so we talk about wellness and we talk about how we can manage our stress and pressure throughout the school year. And Natalie Vardabasso is here one final time for Assess That with Tom and Nat. And we talk about sustaining change. It's one thing to initiate change, it's quite another to sustain it. Now, one thing to add before we get going here, both the segments with Lindsay and the segment with Natalie were recorded while I was on the road, and the hotel I was in had a little bit spotty Wi-Fi, so there are some technical glitches during the recording on my end. As I said, the weak internet signal contributed to that. I didn't hear any of that until after listening back to each segment, so I just want to apologize for that. I hope it's not too disruptive to your listening of the episode. So Lindsay Titus, Natalie Vardabasso are here, so that's today's plan. Let's get to it. My conversation with Lindsay Titus is coming up. But first, don't at me. But I want to open this week by saying we need to establish some rules about this whole spoiler alert thing because it's getting unreasonable to ask everyone to cater to your viewing habits. Now, at some point, you have to take responsibility for the fact that your viewing choices have taken you in another direction. And the statute of limitations has run out, so the rest of us are going to talk about a show, a movie, or a game if you have chosen not to watch it. This whole no spoilers thing has become quite annoying, if you ask me, as if everyone in society has to cater to your viewing habits in perpetuity. Hey, dude, no spoilers. It's like, dude, it's Gladiator. That movie was released 22 years ago. If you haven't seen it by now, that's on you. Now, this topic has come up for me because last week, I overheard a conversation at the Minneapolis airport that got me thinking about this whole no spoilers thing. I was waiting at my gate for my flight to Green Bay, and behind me, in another row of seats, these three dudes were talking about the show Ozark. Now, I'm not quite sure, based on the conversation, if they had just finished season 4 or were in the midst of season 4, but they were pretty animated about the show, and I, of course, was interested in their conversation because Ozark has been one of my favorite shows over the last number of years. My buddy Steve recommended it to me, and I started watching it, and I loved the show, so I was interested in what they were talking about. Okay, so these three dudes are talking. They're in the midst of this conversation about the show when a fourth bro comes back, that's what we're going to call him, comes back to where they're sitting, And it doesn't take him long to figure out what the others are talking about. They're right behind me, so I can hear the whole thing unfolding. So again, bro number four interjects and says, "Hey, don't spoil it. I haven't watched it yet." And so one of his buddies asked to clarify. He says, "Wait, you haven't finished season 4 yet?" And bro number 4 replies, he's like, "No, I'm only up to season 2. And his friends acquiesced, and they sort of stopped talking. They said, "Oh, sorry, man." That was kind of them, of course. But then it got me thinking. So I got on the internet and I Googled Ozark. Season 2, 2018. Season 3, 2020. 2018. He's watched season 2. 2020 is season 3. So 2 years. They have to wait 2 years until they can talk about the show. But then I thought, well, maybe this friend group just started watching it more recently, like I did, right? I didn't watch it when it first came out. That's fair. Maybe they just started and bro number 4 has to catch up. So I thought, okay, well, that could be true. Fair enough. But that led me to thinking about the hypothetical, which is, how long do your friends have to wait? At what point do you have to manage it versus them being quiet about the show? What is the statute of limitations where it's no longer up to the group, but it's up to you? Yes, it's funny what thoughts you have when you're traveling alone and you're surrounded by conversations that you're privy to, even if you're not directly involved in them, right? But I thought to myself, there has to be a rule. We got to come up with a rule. This idea that we all have to tailor our conversations because of your viewing schedule, nope, sorry, life doesn't work that way. You see and hear this in sports all the time, and it's just so true. Many seem to want everything tailored to their particular schedule. And I'm going to borrow a little bit from one of my favorite sports podcasters, Ryan Russillo, because he often talks about this on his podcast too, and I completely agree with him. When people say, "Oh, the baseball season is too long," well, how about this? How about you start watching baseball in June or July? No one is forcing you to watch baseball in April, as if the baseball season needs to be tailored to your preferences, right? Or people say the NBA should not start until the NFL season is over. Or you could just start watching basketball in February. The evolution of our on-demand society seems to have some thinking that everything can and should be tailored for them. And I, for one, have kind of had it with all of that. So I'm here to declare a societal rule around spoilers that I think is pretty reasonable to both sides of this conversation. Okay, let's begin with movies. Movies. You have 6 months. If you haven't watched a movie within 6 months of its release, then did you really want to watch it? 6 months. After 6 months, people are free to talk about the movie in your presence. Now, listen, if you don't want to hear it, if you don't want the spoiler, just leave the room for a few minutes and let your friends or your colleagues have their conversation. For you to sit there and say no spoilers after 6 months, no, sorry, I'm not having it. That's on you. You need to manage this. It's not up to them. All right, what about a TV series? You've got 1 year or whenever the next season is released, whichever comes first. Again, if you don't want the series ruined for you, then you can remove yourself from the conversation. If season 2 is out and you haven't watched season 1, then that's on you. And I ask again, if that TV series were a priority for you, you would have watched it. The idea that we all have to not talk about something because you didn't have your viewing priorities in order, nope, not going to have it. Go use the restroom, check your email, go on TikTok, do something to occupy yourself. You feel like you're missing out on the conversation? Well, then you should have watched the show, shouldn't you? Okay, what about sports? Here's the rule for sports. You got 48 hours. If you couldn't watch the game but you recorded it, you have 48 hours to watch, or we're talking about it. No spoilers? That's on you to manage that, not us. We're not waiting a week until you finally watch the game, because what if you don't watch it? If you don't want to hear the conversation and haven't watched it, it's up to you to manage your own spoilers, okay? I'd probably say the same thing, 48 hours, if it's some sort of appointment viewing that some people have, like The Bachelor or Bachelorette or something like that. Can't leave you all out of the mix either. Appointment viewing, 48 hours, that's the rule. Now listen, we got to have a rule on the other side of this too. If you're part of the group talking about a movie, a TV series, or a game, and someone voluntarily removes themselves temporarily to avoid the spoilers, you got 15 minutes to get it all out. And then you have to invite Chuck back into the mix. Now, if it's sports, we're going to say 20 minutes if it's one of your favorite teams, 25 minutes if it's a playoff game, and 30 minutes if it's your favorite team in a playoff game. You go any longer than 30 minutes, just send Chuck home, tell him you'll talk to him tomorrow. Okay, those are the rules. Those are the spoiler rules, as I declare them today. No spoilers? Sure, to a point, but at some point, you have to own the fact that your viewing priorities didn't match ours. Joining me this week is Lindsay Titus, an educator for 16 years. Lindsay has worked as a classroom teacher and behavioral specialist in public school, residential, and private settings. She is currently an assistant principal, and she is driven to teach other educators how to transform connections and relationships with all students. She also helps educators transform their own lives by finding their authentic purpose and their passion both inside and outside the classroom. Lindsay is also the host of the Define YOUniversity, and that U is spelled Y-O-U, the Define YOUniversity podcast, to which I am a subscriber. So I'm very much looking forward to having Lindsay here. Lindsay, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. This is obviously our first time meeting face-to-face. We've been connected online, and certainly I've been a consumer of your content, and we've exchanged messages and things like that. But of course, this is the first time face-to-face. I'm a listener of your podcast. I'm a follower of your work. So I am really excited that you're here today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So before, though, we dive into the substance of the conversation that we're going to have today, highlight for us, I gave some of the highlights in the introduction, but maybe put a little more substance behind the resume, the journey so far. You know, where did you begin your career? How did you end up where you are today as someone who's really focused on the adults in the education system in terms of both how they guide student behavioral change, as well as how they rediscover their own passions for life in and outside the classroom? So take us through that journey, Lindsay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's unique, as you mentioned, is I've had a lot of roles in education in a variety of different settings. And that was not intentional. That was not my plan going into this career. Way back in second grade was the year that I was like, I'm going to be a teacher. I had a phenomenal second grade teacher. I had just moved to Buffalo from Canada, and she made me feel so welcome. She made me feel a part, even though I had, I sounded different. I really didn't know what was going on. And she really kind of planted that seed. And that seed was very much like my goal for really all through high school, through college. I had no doubts I'm going to be a teacher. In college, I fell in love with the field, the specialized programming within special education. So I was like, okay, great. I'm narrowed in a little bit more. I'm going to be a special educator. That's going to be my career. That's it. I landed a job my first year out where I had student taught. About 3 months in, I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. And it was so scary because of like, wait a second, this was my life's passion. This is the only thing that I'd seen myself doing. And I luckily had some really supportive mentors and friends around me that said, just keep at it. You can do this. And I ended up teaching for about 5 years in a self-contained special education classroom. During that time, though, I noticed I was going home. And I think something that's really important for anybody, but educators especially, is pay attention to our thoughts, right? Sometimes I think we want to run away from those thoughts. We want to just like take the teacher hat off and be like, I don't want to think about it till tomorrow. But I found myself really paying attention to those thoughts at night. What was keeping me up? What couldn't I figure out? And at that time, it was behavior. I was going home, really thinking about my students' behavior. Why can't I get this kid to do that? What is happening? Where's the disconnect? Why is he doing this? Why is she doing that? And that was the part that I really had no answers. In my both undergrad and master's, I had like one class in management and behavior. So I really was lost. And so I went back to school at that point and became a board certified behavior analyst. and really fell in love with behavior change and studying human development. Why do we do the things we do? And so the next 10 years, I really had different roles in behavior. So behavior specialist, behavior consultant, lots of different labels, but different areas. I worked for a non-for-profit for a long time, and I very well might still be there if it didn't close. It closed automatically. I didn't have a choice to leave that one. That chapter ended outside of my control. I did some in-home therapy. I worked at a residential center. Ultimately, though, my family goals became really important, and I wanted to get back into the public school sector as I had started. And so at my current district, I was a behavior specialist for 4 years. And then last year transitioned into assistant principal where I am now, heading into year 2 as that. So the behavior piece kind of stemmed from those early years. The wellness, the burnout, the understanding who you are, that came because I had my own burnout. I was ready to be done. I couldn't do it anymore. And I was a chaser. I kept finding, well, maybe this job will be the job where I finally have balance. Maybe this will be the job where I can finally feel like I want to feel. And what I finally realized is I was never going to find it outside of myself. It always had to come from within. And so I learned how to do that inner work, which is what I then teach and coach, because we don't often learn it if we don't seek it out to do that. So once I had learned it and done it myself, I could teach others. And I think that's a huge thing. Like, we all have skills that we can teach others. And so as soon as I felt like I was comfortable in my own skin in what I could do, and really had this renewed passion for life inside and outside of the classroom, I was able then to share that. And so that's really where Define University came from. So I could coach others so they too could be living this lifestyle, because it's totally doable for anybody out there.
Right. It's so fascinating to me that so many of us generally we try to chase that happiness, we try to chase that satisfaction with something outside, something tangible, and time again we come back to the idea that this is, what do they call that, this is an inside job. This is something where within ourselves we need to find that and stop chasing it from the outside. But I think, Lindsay, we have to go back to something you mentioned, which I'm sure listeners, you may have heard it in the beginning. You lived in Canada. And of course, being someone who is from Canada, from Vancouver, we always get excited when Canada is mentioned. So are you Canadian, or are you just a wannabe? What's happening here, Lindsay? Talk to me about this Canada experience you had.
So I was born in Canada. I was born in Brampton, outside of Toronto.
Absolutely. See, I knew I liked you.
And I am American. I became American when I was 21. So I went through the whole naturalization process when I was 21, and have been a citizen since. But other than my immediate family, everybody else still lives in and around Ontario. So I haven't seen them in a few years, but I'm excited that the borders have opened up and I can now start seeing them a little bit more often.
So were you a Canadian citizen by birth and then you changed your citizenship, or do you have dual citizenship at this point?
I don't. So I had to pick. So apparently you're over 18, you have to say which one you want. And so I knew, I was going to be in the States. At that point I had met who's now my husband. And so, I was like, we're going to do it. But yes, have those Canadian roots for sure.
All right. Once a Canadian, always a Canadian, Lindsay. You're always welcome back across the border, of course. You know how it works. Now, listen, we are in late August here, and at this point, every educator is either been back to work for a month, they've been back to work for a few weeks, or they are on the cusp of going back to work just after Labor Day. So everyone at this point is in startup mode, and I want to talk to you about that from an educator's perspective. I'm sure that real balance in education is really hard to achieve because, listen, the job is just that demanding. But I do think it's important that educators find some semblance of balance to sustain themselves throughout the year. And so often teachers, administrators, even central office staff come back and they say, okay, this is the year. This is the year I maintain balance. This is the year I pull it all together. But inevitably, for so many, that plan unravels and they're right back where they swore they never were going to be. They're overwhelmed and they're just trying to survive. So from your perspective, Lindsay, what are some of the most effective strategies or approaches that you've seen that help educators, teachers, administrators, help them avoid that physical and or that emotional drop-off that can happen during the year?
Yeah, and it absolutely can, right? So I think of kind of two things. I think the first, I think it was kind of like the resolutions, right? That we set resolutions in January and by February they're gone. I used to be a resolution person. I am not anymore. I do pick a word for each year. I'll tie this in just a second. But I think what's more important that I do each year is I reassess the standards that I live by. So many people will set boundaries. I don't necessarily do boundaries because I think boundaries will get broken at certain times and places. And then I know for myself, I always felt like, oh, I broke that boundary, got to start over. Whereas for me, I pick standards that I live by. So standard for me is I check my energy. I check in on my own energy every single day. That way I don't get to, the middle of the year and I realize, man, my energy's gone because I've checked it every single day. That's a standard I live by. It's a non-negotiable. So I think part of this process is to also knowing that how you almost can like know how you're going to feel, right? Like if every year, if you know yourself, if you, and just think about it, right? By about November, December, are you a November person? Are you a December? Maybe you're a March. Where is it that if we have this information, I coach this on, student behavior all the time. If you have a student's behavior, you can do like preventative, kind of visualization, right? If this student does this, I'm going to do this. Well, it's the same thing here you can do for yourself. I'm going to do these things. Knowing that I myself get frustrated, get less energy in November, here's what I'm going to do. Like own it, right? I guess it's what I'm trying to say is like own that it's going to happen. Don't try and like hide from it. Be honest with yourself because then you're going to be more in tune to using strategies. So a couple that I absolutely love is a couple years ago dropped the word balance. Again, I'm a very big word person and a visual person. So for me, balance, I think of a scale, I think science class, and I think 50-50. And we all know that's not possible. So I switched balance for blended. And so I always say I live a blended lifestyle, but I'm always 100% me. And so if I'm starting to feel, again, off balance, I'll use that word. Like if I'm starting to feel off centered, I will remind myself I'm 100% me. And what does that mean? That means on some days I might work 80% and I might have family 20%. That is actual, that might happen. But I then get to choose, maybe Saturday then is 95% family, 5% define you. I get to decide, and so do you, right? You get to decide what those percentages are. Now you don't have to get so analytical, but it's that concept that you get to blend it all together if it's meaningful to you. So I keep that mindset at the forefront, and then do those energy check-ins. I do them like about 3 times a day. When I first started, I put reminders on my phone and would have them, and I just do like a 1 to 5 mental scale. Where am I? If I'm like 5, I'm like 4 or 5, I'm good. Awesome. I celebrate it. If I'm like a 1 or a 2, okay, what am I going to do to raise my energy? Do I need water? Did I eat yet today? Do I need to go walk around my building? Do I need to get outside? Do I need to phone a friend? Like, what do I need to kind of do I need to listen to some music? I have an Energizer playlist on my phone. Do I need to like listen to some pump me up music? Those truly do, because it brings it all to the present, right? Brings it all to this very moment, which is where we can make change happen. The other thing is schedule in advance, right? Schedule things that you're going to look forward to. I always do at the beginning of every month, I pick 2 days on the weekends where I put a big heart on the calendar. Those are me days. And right now they're me/family days. They're I get to decide, so that if someone calls me up and says, hey, do you want to come and do this? And I look and there's a heart, I'm going to pause for a second and say, you know what? I already planned something that day. Could we do another day? Or maybe I say yes, if it is something I want. The point is, so often I hear from so many people, and I was in the same boat, we get to the end of the month, we're like, man, where'd my weekends go? Right? I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything that I wanted to. Well, you got to schedule it in. So if December is your tough, go schedule things now, right? Figure out what it is you love. If you want to get away, if you want to have, whatever it is that brings you joy, go schedule it, get it on your calendar now, so that you're not trying to do it reactively. You can actually do it proactively to make sure it happens. The last thing is kind of know your own pain points, right? So know what drains your energy, because that's you, right? So for me, it was to-do lists. To-do lists drained my energy completely, right? Just looking at it, I would have this moment of panic, like never going to get done. I can't do it all. And so I shifted. A to-do list for me is no more than 3 things. I use a Post-it because that fits small things. Anything more goes on a brain dump list, and that's it. It's not a to-do list, it's a brain dump. It's just something I thought of. So for me, I don't really even use to-do lists anymore. Like, it's gotten to the point where I'm like, it'll get done. I'll put it on my calendar and it's done. Boom. I don't need to write it on a list because that was draining my energy, right? I wasn't feeling productive. Therefore I wasn't feeling worthy. Then you're feeling down, and that doesn't feel good. But you have to know what's your own pain point. So then you can think of a way to kind of counteract that. But I think it really is being prepared. It's knowing what's coming and making sure that we're already kind of thinking ahead so we can start practicing those today when we are calmer, when we are a little bit less chaotic, I'll say.
Yeah, well, that's true. I've often thought about the expression over the years that if it's predictable, it's preventable. And I think that's really what you're referring to here, is that unless you're brand new to the profession, you have a sense of what your year might look like. And therefore, you can kind of know where those ups and downs come from. The idea of being metacognitive, right? Being aware of yourself. It's interesting to me that so often we as educators talk about the importance of metacognition for students in terms of their own learning. And yet we ourselves don't make the connection to how important it is to be reflective and metacognitive about our own wellness and our own ups. Why do you think that is? Just to throw that at you. Why do you think we fail to make that connection sometimes as educators?
I think because every definition of teaching is always student driven. It's always about student learning, student growth.
Mhm.
It's really not ever centered on like who am I, right? I've always said if I could go back, or one of my big lofty goals is to redo some like new teacher prep programs and have a mindset course in there, or a self-help sounds corny, but where you learn this mindset work, because you lose yourself so quickly. We're so compassionate to our students, and we forget. I think we solely forget because that's not what is prioritized. And so if we don't prioritize it for ourselves, nobody's going to do it for us. And so to me, that's it. I just think it's not prioritized as much as, you think teacher, you think students, right? Student growth. That's usually the word association that would come. We don't think teacher self-understanding.
Yeah. We have been both conditioned outside, but also inside, put students at the center, and therefore to sacrifice our personal time, our any downtime, because we should always be putting our students at the center. And then society has a tendency to make teachers feel guilty about taking time for themselves as well. So I think it's wise advice to set up some sort of system, or think about a way that you can manage your wellness ahead of time, rather than when you're in the midst of the chaos and now it's triage, as opposed to having a plan to maintain that. Now, beginning of the year, of course, it's also a time for us to build strong relationships with students. And this is a time where we forge those relationships, and they don't necessarily develop overnight. You don't just walk in the first week and you've got this deep relationship. And for some students, it takes them a long time to kind of let their guard down. Who is this adult and who am I working with here? But if we think about this more generically, what are some ways so 2 questions. What are some ways that teachers, educators can begin to build really strong, and I think the key word for me is authentic, relationships with their students? And the second part is, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to have a strong, authentic relationship with your students? How do I know I've got that kind of relationships with my kids?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that is so important for educators to do is really define the words that you're using, right? So, and probably no surprise, I mean, my business is YOUniversity. So like defining words is really important to me. But I think it's a really great exercise for your listeners to do right now. Like, jot down, what does strong mean to you and what does authentic mean to you? Because if you don't have that basis, right, of a definition, anything's going to sound good. Anything's going to, be in there. And so for me, I think doing that first, right? So strong, and I kind of lump them together. So strong and authentic to me means both individuals are showing up as themselves. So if we break that down even further, that means I have to know myself. And then my student has to know themselves. Well, I work in a junior high. My students don't know themselves yet. They do at a surface level, right? I mean, they're learning and they learn every day, but I also have to honor that. And so I think if we are looking to create relationships, which I don't think there's an educator out there that wouldn't say that's not, the number one importance. But I think we also have to remember it is a process. It's something that you practice every single day. To me, it's I said, I don't love to-do lists, and the reason for it is because I think the things that really should be on to-do lists are things like that, right? Connecting with students, building relationships, gratitude practice. Those are things we get to practice every single day, both as educators and just human beings. And so for me, showing up as, having that strong, authentic relationship with a student it completely anchors to honesty. It's not sugar-coated. It's not, just a positive, you're doing great, but you're able to have those real courageous conversations with your students at the level that they're at, right? It's going to look very different with a kindergartner than it is a ninth grader. And so I think being able to agree and disagree, respectfully with one another, being able to share insights that match the relationship, right? So a teacher or, an AP to a student is going to be different than, me to my own child at home. To me, it comes down to not taking things personally, but staying personally connected to that person, right? And also learning to hear through what they're saying. So I think when it's authentic, you're able to know that there's a filter, right? When I'm hearing things, I'm going to filter it based on my own bias, based on my own experiences, based on who I am. And so really making sure that I am working with that student to fully understand where they're coming from. But I think I could go on for hours, but the easy answer to me is that it's honest. It's an honest understanding between two people.
Yeah, that honesty, showing up as yourself. I love that. That's the authenticity. I think when it's strong, it can withstand the ups and downs, the disagreements, because that there is a strength or a bond there for sure. I want to throw a scenario your way because I think many teachers kind of face this scenario that can be challenging. Let's imagine that this year I'm a classroom teacher and I'm teaching a student that I had last year. And last year, let's just say our relationship was tense. And we didn't, it was just less than favorable. We really didn't get along. It's not about, assigning blame. It's just, it is what it is. We had a really rough year together and we just didn't sort of align. And now next year or this coming school year, here I am, I'm teaching that same student. What is some advice that you would give to that teacher as they go in, they look at that class roster and they kind of have that moment of pause where they think, oh boy, here we go again. And students probably thinking the same thing when they look at their schedule. So advice for teachers on how to handle a situation where you're teaching a student that you had before where the relationship was less than favorable.
Yeah, so I think it's two parts, right? So I think the first part is we have to work through those, oh my goodness, feelings first. Do those at home, do those in your office or your classroom. Don't do them with the student. Because we have to, again, one of my goals is to help people stop running from their emotions, right? I think so often you shouldn't feel that. And I have a thing with should, get out of shouldville because it's not a good place to be. And so if you look at your class roster and you get that feeling, honor it. Say, okay, I'm feeling something. Where is this coming from? Right? It's that trigger component. What about this is triggering me? What didn't happen last year that I want to happen this year? That reflection piece. And it doesn't mean it has to take all day or all week. It can be a 5-10 minute, little activity. But if we don't honor that immediate emotional response we had, we're gonna see it in the classroom because there's gonna be no way because we haven't addressed it. And in order, I always think emotions are energy in motion. They're meant to move. So if we try and stuff it down, and this is coming from someone that's a notorious stuffer, I don't want to deal with it. I'm just gonna pretend it didn't happen. Not gonna happen. That was me for years. Now I get that feeling. I'm like, oh, where'd that come from? What's that telling me? What do I need? What am I looking to unpack? So I think we have to do that work so we know what is going on. And then when we're in that place, again, I think it comes back to an honest conversation with the student where we are owning our part, right? I'm here to recognize that last year did not go how I would have wanted. I'm curious your thoughts, and give them the time and space, right? Give them the floor to agree or disagree. And really to not force, I think it's really important that we don't force a relationship because some students, as you alluded to earlier, just aren't ready for it. And I use that, I'm very real with the students that I work with to say, I understand if you might not be ready, know that I am here. I'm going to keep showing up. This is how I like to show up. Does that work for you? How would you like me to show up? How would you like me to know that? Because I think something I always come back to too is we want to be 100% invested, right? 100% invested in this relationship, but I'm only 50% of that relationship, right? A relationship has to be two people. So if it's me and a student, I can bring 100% of me, but it's only 50%. And so not forcing it and having, I think, a lot of small conversations, right? This is the power of like the 30 seconds at a time versus we're going to sit down for an hour and have a powwow. Like that's not probably going to do much. But if we just show up in whatever that looks like, the hays, the highs, the how was the game last night? Hey, I noticed this. Just asking questions even. Hey, my nephew is your age and his birthday's coming up. Any ideas for a present? Like just things that you can get the student talking, I think take some of that formality out of it. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. As you were talking there, you reminded me of that expression. It's more about friendship necessarily than teacher-student relationships, but it still, I think, holds true that friendship isn't one big thing. It's a million little things. Mm-hmm. And it seems that building a relationship is, and recovering from that, say, 10th year that you had last year is not about the big epic conversation. It's about the little things, it's the day-to-day interactions and slowly beginning to shift the paradigm around that relationship. So it makes a lot of sense to me for sure. And we still know, of course, Lindsay, that tough days are going to happen to us, whether it's with students, whether it's with parents who are upset with you. Maybe there's a colleague with whom you have some tension, a particularly challenging situation with a student or whatever. Now, going to your podcast now, in episode 92, you walked listeners through 4 steps that you use to rebound from a tough day. So I thought maybe you could share that with us. The tough days happen. This is a really challenging profession. We're going to have those tough days. What are the strategies? How do we rebound from a tough day and not let that become a tough week or a tough month?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's so important to recognize, again, they will happen, right? And yeah. I will always go back to, again, I used to be someone like, if the first 30 minutes of the day were challenging, the day was ruined, right? It's a challenging day. So I think even just the way that we talk about the days or talk about these moments is really important. So now I've shifted my language that it's not a challenging day. It's a day that had challenging moments in it, or it's a day that had some tough moments in it, even if they were all day. I don't want to say all, because I guarantee there was some sliver of the day that was not tough, and having 2 young kids at home, like there's no way that a hug from my kid is ever tough. Like that's the grateful part of my day, right? Maybe on some days. And so I think it's really important that we do that. But the 4 steps that I take after these days that have those challenges where you just want to bang your head against the wall, or you're just so frustrated, or in the episode I mentioned, for me, it's tears. I have to shut my office door because the tears are coming. That's how I know I've reached, that point for me. The first step is very, very probably obvious, but it's giving yourself grace. But I go beyond that, because I think grace, and I learned this over the last 10 months when I kind of had my own season of pause as I was pregnant with my second child, is I think we say a lot of times that we give ourselves grace, but we don't actually practice it. We don't actually put it into action. And so the first step for rebounding for me is doing that. And it's hard because I can't say, here are the 5 ways to show yourself grace or to practice, but it still alludes to feeling the feelings, right? Giving yourself permission to sit with it, or giving yourself permission to not know the answer, giving yourself permission to figure it out, giving yourself permission to cry, giving yourself permission to call a friend and ask for help. Like, what is it that you're going to do to really show yourself that you are human, that you are allowed to have these emotions? The second one is feel the feels, is sit with the emotion. That's so hard for so many of us. I always say start with 15 seconds. Because again, anytime I say a strategy, I think so many of us, our minds go, that's going to take so long. And I don't have time in my day to do another thing. I want you to flip that. I want you to honor that there's always enough time. Just make that switch right now, because there truly is always enough time. And then you're not chasing more time. But sit for 15 seconds and see what is that actual feeling. Is it truly boredom? Is it stress? Is it anxiety? Is it frustration? Is it happiness? What is it? Label it so that we can then move forward. The third step is to find some gratitude in something. So I do it in the situation. I'm at a point now where I will say, I'm grateful for this. This is pushing me. This is pushing me outside my comfort zone. I'm doing something that's probably really hard. That's why it's challenging me. And I'm grateful for that, because I know I'm going to grow. I didn't start out there. I started out, I'm grateful for every other positive thing, right? I'm grateful for a supportive principal. I'm grateful for that cup of coffee I had this morning. I'm grateful for the sunshine. You can't do it wrong. That's the beauty with gratitude. You cannot do that practice wrong. And so practice that gratitude. And then the fourth step is to really anchor in and learn the lesson. And that may not happen that day, but everything is happening to teach us so we can grow and we can expand in who we are. And so when we can, through reflection, through honestly just thinking about it, sometimes talking about it, writing it out, when we find the lesson, that's how we know it was purposeful. There still was a reason that day was challenging. And when we find that lesson, then it's a little bit easier to move forward and not kind of try and hold on to it, right? We can like detach and let it be. And now it's a new day.
I know that some people kind of bristle at this idea of everything happens for a reason. And I know that can be cliche at sometimes, but I do think it's important for us to take lessons out of these experiences. And a lot of times you don't know what that lesson is or that quote unquote reason is until after the fact. And it really isn't about like, this is divine intervention causing you grief for a month or a week, but it's really about the idea that how am I growing as an individual, right? I also really appreciated your, the idea of feel the feels. That resonated with me when I first listened to that episode, because that's something I've learned to do over the course of my career, which is to give myself, like, own those feelings, give myself an opportunity to honor those feelings, even if it's for a short period of time, have my pity party, and then find a way to move forward on it. And I certainly appreciated those strategies as well. I want to finish up with something else that you talked about on your podcast as well. Nothing like everybody bringing up all your past episodes, right? But something else you talked about on the podcast, and I think you kind of alluded to this earlier, but I want to expand on this, and that's this idea of how do I know the difference between procrastination and rest, right? I think as teachers, administrators, we can always be working. The job is never done. There's always something that could be done. And so am I procrastinating? Am I resting? Like, I think you did allude to this a little bit tangentially, but I want to come back to it because I think this is a really important point for educators, that we've got to find time to rest. We've got to find time for our own wellness. But how do I know the difference between procrastinating and rest?
Mm-hmm. So I look at them, and this might be the behavior, the behavior side of me. I look at procrastination as reactive. I'm not doing something because I'm reacting to a stressful situation, just feeling overwhelmed, right? More of some of those I'm going to call them negative, but they're not really negative, but negative side of the emotion. Whereas for me, rest, I label resting with intention. So that's, again, I mentioned standards in the beginning of the episode. I rest with intention every day. Now, some days that's 3 minutes. Some days it's an hour, right? It varies. The difference is before I rest, whatever that looks like. Maybe it's a walk. Doesn't mean, laying down, but it might be a walk, listening to a podcast, going to a park, whatever it might be. In my head, I say, I am resting to, and then what's the purpose? Why am I resting right now? To give my mind, an opportunity to just relax from today, to spend time with my daughter so that I can be ready for the meeting I'm having in an hour, whatever it is, right? There's no right or wrong, but I think that's the difference, right? Procrastination, you're generally running from something, and resting is you're getting ready for something. So I look at them as kind of opposite sides of the spectrum. And I think if you kind of want to figure out which one it is, ask yourself why. Right? Why am I not doing X, Y, and Z? Or why do I feel this way about X, Y, and Z? I think resting usually has more of a purpose. Procrastinating is I'm kind of avoiding something.
Yeah, we all tend to do that for sure. I sometimes subscribe to this notion of do something. So I've often found myself in situations where, like, I don't feel like writing, or I don't feel like editing, or I don't feel like doing some heavy lifting. So I say, well, you got to do something. Let's make this time productive. And I do something, sort of some of the menial tasks, right? Do some paperwork, or do some, getting things organized or whatever. So I find myself at least getting productive when I have those moments where I just don't feel like doing the heavy lifting, finding those ways to at least keep moving forward. Even if it's a menial task, I can get something done. Any before we finish up here, Lindsay, any final words of wisdom or advice for educators as they embark on the 2022-23 school year? What are some things? Obviously, the pandemic is still around, not the same as it was a few years ago, but it's still there and something we also have to deal with. So, any final thoughts, words of wisdom as people sort of get energized for the new school year?
Yeah, so I use analogies a lot. And so the analogy I want to share is, and it's ironic you're wearing a hat because it has to do with a hat.
All
um,
right, perfect.
but I do, what's your vision? Is it hat on or hat off? And
Mm,
so what that means is, if you have a ball cap on, your field of vision is limited. You're a little bit skewed. You can turn your head and look, left and right, but just your periphery is blocked a little bit. Whereas if you take your hat off, you have a much wider view. And so my reminder with that is to remember that there's going to be situations that you need your hat on. You have to stay focused. You got to stay in your lane, do your thing, and trust that that's the way to go. There's going to be other times, maybe it's a new unit you can explore with, or a new strategy. Like, take the hat off, expand, and just kind of take it all in. And recognize your whole year does not have to be hat on, like head down, like let's go 100 miles an hour. You can take the hat off and truly look around, see what your neighbor teacher is doing, see what the person down the hall is doing. Find a friend online and see what's going on, check in with them. And, so I've heard it kind of relate to like front view, like front row at the theater, and then balcony view. I think you just know that you're going to have both. And know that that's okay. Give yourself permission to take the hat. I think as educators, sometimes we just need permission to take the hat off in that analogy, because we do say it's okay to take the hat off and go just be you this weekend and let schoolwork stay at school. Like, that is okay. But I think the reason it's so hard for so many of us is because we don't give ourselves permission to do it, because it becomes a should. And so stay out of shouldville by honoring, I'm taking the hat off and I'm going to leave it here, and it's going to be there, and I'm going to put it on with pride Monday morning, and I'm going to be there for it. But understand you're going to ebb and flow with that throughout the year.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. And I think one more thing I might add. Hey, I like your analogy, but I'm going to add something to it. That's not really what I'm doing here. But what it makes me think of is that our hats are on and off at different points during the year. So if, for example, as a teacher, your hat is on and you're focused and someone else's hat is off, that is not the time for wow, must be nice to not have to be so this, or must be nice not have to do that. It makes me think that we need to be able to step back a little bit from that and honor the fact that our ebbs and flows are different from one another. And because your hat is on doesn't mean my hat needs to be on, that I could maybe be pulling back a little bit, have that balcony view while you're in the front row, because at some point during the year, you're going to be in the balcony and I'm going to be in the front row. I'm going to have my hat on. You're going to have my hat off. I think we need to be kind to one another and not sort of eat our own, as we on occasion can sometimes do when we're in the midst of our chaos as well. Right. So two questions as we finish up today, Lindsay. I really appreciate the conversation. These are questions that I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. And here's the first one, and you can take this in any direction that you want to. But educationally speaking, the question is, what keeps you up at night?
So we kind of alluded to it earlier, and it really relates to this concept of how do I help teachers? How do we help teachers define who they are? How do we allow teachers to be more than the teacher, and be proud of that, right? How do we, change or alter or update, revamp, whatever it is, new teacher programs, so that they're coming in knowing values and missions and all of these things for themselves as well as their classrooms. I think that's such a big part that's missing. And so I'm constantly racking my brain, like, what are other ways that we can get this work into the world?
Yeah, for sure. That definitely is a worthy reason to be kept up at night, for sure. Last question as we finish up today, and this is a question you can answer personally, you can answer it professionally, you can answer it in both ways. Again, take this in any directions you want, but it really has to do with how you personally define success. If a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, what is your definition of success? How would you answer them?
So if you had asked me this question 5 years ago, I would have given you some like tangible response, right? Like, when this happens, I will be successful, because success for me was always something you attained. And again, through all of this work that I've done, I've learned that if you have something out here in the future, it's going to stay in the future. So we've got to bring it into the present day. So today, if you were to ask me that, I would say this moment right here. this moment right here is successful because, or it's success because I'm here. And there's purpose and there's passion and I'm in the present moment. And to me, that's what's so important. One of the quotes that's in my journal is, I'm perfect in the present moment, because it's not something to achieve. It's who I'm showing up as, because that's all I know to show up as. So success for me is who you are in every moment, who you're being, so that you can continue to learn and grow into future, days, moments, whatever you might call it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The idea that success is not so much a destination, but a series of moments where we are authentic, we show up, and there's passion, there's purpose, and we are here in this present moment, and that makes us successful. I love that. Listeners, you really can and should connect with Lindsay. You can find her on social media. Twitter, the handle is at LTitus828. That's the Twitter handle. On Instagram, the handle is at Lindsay Titus EDU. Her website is www.defineuniversity.com. Again, remember that U in university is YOU. And of course, she is a podcaster as well. She hosts the Define University show podcast with Lindsay Titus. Lindsay, you've been on about a 10-month hiatus. You're about to bring some episodes back. You mentioned that you had just had your second child. So congratulations on your second child. And of course, we've seen pictures on Instagram. And of course, like they're great pictures, cute pictures, and certainly you appear to be thriving as I wouldn't say new mother, because you're not a new mother, but you're a renewed mother to an infant in the work. So we, as selfishly as listeners, we're going to look forward to some new content coming out on the podcast. Listeners, I'll have links for all of the social media handles, the website, and the podcast in the show notes as we go. Lindsay, really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, to meet with you. Thanks for being here. I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate the time, and I had a blast. So thank you.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcast. Now let's get back to the episode.
All right. Assess that. Tom and Nat. Welcome back, Natalie.
Hey, Tom.
Good to see you again. And this, of course, is our last recording of the Assess That with Tom and Nat over the summer. I have a feeling we're going to revisit this throughout the school year at times. I think we'll set some plans to have you come back and continue to talk about assessment. But for now, this is our last session for the summer. And you had suggested a topic that we explored today, and that is the idea of sustaining change. So what's on your mind with sustaining change and moving in that direction?
Well, first of all, I think we just made plans for this to happen again. So that's a thing. We're going to manifest that. And secondly, I feel like this conversation's come up for me a lot in the past couple weeks. And perhaps it's because of what's going on in BC and there's some big reporting changes coming. But I've been hearing shreds of that age-old tale of, this is just another fad in education and the pendulum's going to swing and then it's going to swing a different way. And there is really that ethos in the educational space that everything's just a flash in the pan and nothing actually sticks, which really begs the question, then how do you actually sustain change? Like if we're talking about something like standards-based grading or sound assessment principles, this isn't new. Like some of the research into why we need a course scale with fewer levels is like a century old. So how do we actually in our communities take action in a way that sticks long term? And then a follow-up question to that I think I have is, what's the tipping point? So if you're in a school community and you're really passionate about making these changes stick, how do you know when it's tipped past the point of no return? So I'm going to throw it to you first and hear your thoughts.
It's an interesting thing that some will say. I think there's a number of different reasons why people say, this is just a fad. Everything old is new again, swinging the pendulum. And my experience has taught me that more often than not is a way of opting out. It's either a way of like reducing or dismissing a significant or an important change with a sort of cynical view, over your glasses, over top of your reading glasses, and we've seen this before. It's a way of opting out. But one of the things I also learned is that sometimes what looks like resistance or hesitation is a lack of understanding or a lack of clarity. And so what's really hard for some is to admit that there's a different way. And that I've been doing certain things for 20 to 25 years, for example, and now a new reporting order in BC comes along, new changes happening in our school, and I don't really understand it. So it's easier for me to save face and just say, that's a bad idea. Everything old is new again. Oh, here we go again with another fad. Someone's doing their PhD, those types of cynical views. So for me, that pendulum swing, I think in order to avoid that, we have to make sure that what we're implementing is grounded in sound principles or sound research, right? So it's not Tom's thing. It's not Natalie's thing. It's not my opinion. Often when I talk about grading, I talk about standards-based grading. I make sure people know right off the bat that we are not going to have a philosophical conversation about grading, because we don't need a grading philosophy. We need grading practices that align with sound assessment principles and practices. So that can kind of undercut the whole notion that it's just a trend, it's just a fad, that type of idea. So that for me would be my initial reaction to that comment. I think we can maybe get to that tipping point. Do you want to get to that now, or we can maybe go to that a little bit later? But that for me is my initial reaction, is when somebody says that, it feels more like they're trying to opt out of the change rather than lean into a potential change that could be better.
Yeah, it's those limiting beliefs, right, that people will throw up and as a way to say, guess I can't do it, right? What are you going to do? The idea of grounding really resonates with me as you were talking, because I think often we forget to ground things that we want to implement in a really, really solid why. And I know this is nothing new, and we hear this all of the time. We know Simon Sinek's golden circle and all of that. But I think really investing time in clarifying a really aspirational vision of why we are doing this, like what is the outcome that we seek that will require us to take up this learning again and again and again. And then just when we thought we're done, we're going to have to take it up again, because that outcome of empowering learners is forever going to be something we can keep picking up strategies to work towards. And you did this so well in the tenets framework in the essential assessment book, where you've got hope, efficacy, and achievement. But I think putting those things at the center, and I had a colleague that once called our assessment framework that we'd made in my last context an Apple store. And finally I asked him, I was like, what do you mean by that? An Apple store, like selling iPads or something? And he said, no, it's that everybody is invited into it and nobody can argue against it. It's just, we're talking about being purposeful, accurate, informative, empowering. Like these are all things that people go, yeah, of course I want that in my assessment practice. And it opens up a conversation to continue learning towards that continuously. Because I don't think we should ever stop learning when it comes to assessment and grading. It's truly one of those areas where it's like, the more you know you don't know. And you just have to keep going.
If people were honest, they would recognize and realize, and inside, I think they know this stuff doesn't just fall out of the sky. And that's an expression I've been using a lot lately, because one of the advantages of, I suppose, being older, I don't want to say I'm old, but I'm being older and having, this now being my 32nd year in education going into the fall, you have some historical perspective, and you recognize that a lot of the work, for example, the fewer, more clearly distinguishable levels, grading on levels versus the percentage scale, that didn't just come out of the sky where people just decided to disrupt the grading system for no reason. There's research behind that. And I think that most will understand, if you get them in a private moment, they'll understand that it's more about being overwhelmed with having to change what I do as a teacher in my 27th year or my 21st year, or even my 12th year. It's we build habits. You talked about the tipping point and how you know that you've reached a tipping point. And one of the things that I've learned over the years, there's a couple of ways in which you kind of recognize that you've reached a tipping point. What I've noticed is that there is that expression, the vocal minority. And one of the things that I've noticed is that the louder the opposition, usually the smaller the group. I don't say that's always true, but when you have the masses behind you in terms of resistance, you often don't need to be that loud, because you have the volume of people who are resistant to a change. Now, as the change unfolds and more people adopt the new idea, and there's different models and frameworks that have illustrated this over the years, but it's something where I noticed that the more defiant people are, the more loudly they protest. They think they're having an impact, but the truth is that they're really very much in the minority. And so this is their last ditch effort to try to derail or undercut a change effort. Again, not always the case, but I think that vocal minority, the louder the voices, the more isolated those individuals are starting to feel in terms of the change. And to that point, that's when peer pressure starts to work in your favor. When you start to recognize that more people have adopted the new practice, the new strategy, the new idea, the new paradigm, you start to see peer pressure actually starts to work in your favor, in the sense that this is how we do business, and this is how our school operates from an assessment perspective. And that ends up creating that sort of majority minority kind of perspective. It's not that we shouldn't listen to the resistors. They sometimes have ideas we haven't thought of, and we of course have to avoid groupthink. But on the net, I think by and large, I've noticed that the louder the opposition, the more isolated the opposition feels.
I hope we can apply that logic to things like, an insurrection at a Capitol building, say, I don't know, nothing too specific, but, things that are happening in society, because I really...
Just hypothetically, right, Nat?
Just hypothetically, yeah. Like might have happened on like a January date. I don't know. But I think that's a really good point. And I think, yes, and on top of that is, so take those loud voices for what they are and recognize maybe what's happening in the wider community. But another piece of evidence that I like to look for too is, have I created the conditions for a champion to emerge in all of the different kind of sub communities of the school? So for me, I spent a lot of time with the PE team and the options team, which is like integrated studies or enrichment courses, because they're often left out of professional development. That people would be like, I don't know how to, they can just go and prep during that time. But I realized right on that I'm like, wait, they don't have a lot of the pressure that some of these other teachers of like high school math or physics do around changing assessment and grading. They can really iterate, and they just got it. Like, they understand project-based learning. They know what it looks like to give on the fly feedback. So found a person in those groups that was also really fired up about assessment. They wanted to take it on. They wanted to iterate with their group, and then just continued to do that with each pocket. I was like, all right, who do I have in the high school math team that's really fired up about this? How do I spend a lot of time with them elbow to elbow and answer questions? And who do I have in the English team? And who do I have in? And I spent, once it clicked in my brain that was really the secret to the sustainable part of change, I found I was spending 95% of my days actually sitting with people in conversation or co-creating or modeling or coaching in the classrooms, with that intention though of making sure I had someone in every setting who was equally as passionate, equally as knowledgeable, equally as driven to make this happen. And so it was weird for people, like people didn't even know where it was coming from. Like, yeah, maybe I was up at the front at the beginning, sparking things and saying, perhaps we should go in this direction. But I think it's getting those champions in all the communities that is so, so important to keep it moving forward as one.
I think that's a great point, because when I often work with schools and districts, I say, eventually you've got to get to a place where you don't need me anymore. Where you don't need an outside expert, because you have an internal capacity and you have sustainability. Yes, you're right. At first, there may need to be a person who initiates the change, who has some of the expertise, maybe as as we say, one chapter ahead of the kids, or in a position to, begin to initiate some of the big changes. But there does come a point where you've got to duplicate yourself, you've got to replicate your expertise, you've got to expand the network. So there is a place where we can certainly begin to share that capacity, because at some point a change can't be dependent upon one person.
Oh, I could not agree more. In fact, early in my career, a really good piece of advice I got when I was starting down the path of instructional leadership and teacher leadership was, the mark of a leader is that the change will sustain after you're gone. And I really took that to heart, because there are moments when you do have people that are excited. You do have people that want to pick this up. And there's almost, someone once told me the phrase cult of personality that can start to emerge, where, especially if you're someone like myself who gets very excited and very passionate about things, it starts to become like, people call it your baby or your thing, and the last thing you want is something like assessment to belong to one person. So I think that is such wise advice, that how do we make sure it can sustain? And what are we doing to make sure that it'll stay after we are no longer there to actually continue moving it forward? And then something else
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
No. Well, I was just going to say, it's an interesting idea, the cult of personality, because I do think sometimes there is a little bit of charisma that's necessary to kind of initiate the change, but that can be very alluring to people, to leaders, and realize that, and think that it's their personality that's actually driving the change. Where I think we have to recognize that, yes, you may need to have a clever turn of phrase or a little bit of charisma as a leader to initiate some interest in a topic. I don't mean this sort of caricature of charisma, but I just mean that there's a compelling message that is resonating with people. But again, it can't be dependent.
Yeah.
It can't be Natalie's thing. It can't be Tom's thing. It has to sustain itself beyond the people. So beyond the two people or one person who's initiating that change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think when you do recognize that you're falling into that space, though, of being the person who may be initiated, and you have the turns of phrase that come from, years of writing about it or reading about it, you have to constantly be decentering yourself, even in those interpersonal moments of trying to step back into that coach role. And people will then sometimes come to you wanting advice and just tell me what to do. But I found it was so important to always be trying to flip my brain back into a place where I was asking questions or really trying to help others to open their minds to possibilities if they're really dug in. Because they might see you coming and be like, oh, here we go again. It's the assessment guru. I always love that one. Like, it's under my skin.
Yeah.
And it's like you feel the trigger happen, and you're like, oh, your face goes red, and you're like, nope.
Yeah.
In this moment, I am not here to change your mind. I am here to open your mind to the possibilities that something else might be true. And I don't know if you've ever read the book Think Again by Adam Grant. He's an organizational psychologist.
On the list.
Oh, so good. He has one of the most fire questions that has served me very well in my practice. And it's you let someone say their piece, how they need zeros because fear is the only motivator to get kids to learn. Cool. Yeah. Let them say their piece, let them keep talking. And then you just ask the question, I'm just curious, what evidence would convince you to change your mind? Like, what would it be that if you saw it or experienced it, you would maybe believe that wasn't true, and actually get them to answer it. And they basically then coach themselves into a different way of thinking. They'll never admit it to you in front of you, though. That's how all of us humans are with our ego. You just have to carry yourself as if change is right around the corner and you can't see it. You just have to.
Well, I suppose if nothing else, they might, they'll either talk themselves sort of through and workshop that in front of you. Yeah. Or they'll say the quiet part out loud and publicly admit that there's nothing you can show me. I'm convinced of it. Well, then they said it out loud, and at least they've been honest, and where they are in this process. But more importantly, their colleagues have heard the lack of openness to even have a conversation with them. So don't make it about me. Something I often say to groups is, don't do anything because I said so, and don't not do anything because I said so. Don't make Tom the issue. You reflect on the content and think about the ways that we can move forward, the way you can move forward, the way that we can begin to initiate some of those changes. Nat, I want to go back to this idea of expanding your expertise, because maybe as we finish up here, we can get a little bit granular and specific. Can you talk about specifically what did you do to build the capacity of your colleagues? Like, how did you, during the meetings, what were some of the strategies or the approaches? So as people head into the fall now and they're sustaining their efforts and they want to try to expand the expertise in the school, what are some specific ways that you went about that work?
Absolutely. One of my favorite days that we had facilitated when we were first launching the actual framework is we started by doing essentially literature circles. I don't know if you're like book clubs, book talks. I don't know if you're familiar with those. So we'd actually pulled a chapter from one of your newer books, Growing Tomorrow's Citizens in Today's Classroom. It was that first chapter, which is legal to photocopy. Don't worry, I looked into it. And we had photocopied it and we distributed amongst all the staff. We had color-coded stickies on the back. And then those stickies corresponded to different rooms in the school, because we really wanted to break people out of their silos and help them to see things from different points of view. So we gave them the article, told them to go spread out. You have 30 minutes, go read it, annotate it, mark it up, bring your questions. We had an essential question that we said, as a group, you're going to discuss it. And we've got some prompts to help get the discussion going. But your job as a group at the end of that discussion is to have a consensus answer to this question. And so gave people time to read. They came back. It was one of the most engaged and impassioned days I had seen on a professional development day. And at the end of it, the questions that came out, I'll never forget. It was one of my first big PD days I'd facilitated. We have 175 staff. So it was a big deal. And we had a poll everywhere. So as the consensus answers were coming in, we actually had them coming up real time on the screen. And I could not have written them better myself. If I had done a full day of direct instruction telling you what to think and why to think it, I don't think I could have crafted those better. The insights they had, because the question was asking them to make a connection between the theory and the research in the chapter with what we were practically talking about in our context and what the framework was suggesting. And everyone landed there. So that was a really powerful day. And then another day that actually, I think there's so much power in story. I think we underestimate it a lot of the time. We want to jump to the logical explanations of why we should do something as a way to build expertise. And it just doesn't stick and it doesn't land the way we hope. And it starts to become frustrating if you're someone who's trying to build expertise. You're like, it's right there. There's so many facts. And I mean, what's just happened during the pandemic is a great example of facts sometimes aren't enough. And people need to be grabbed on that emotional level as well. So we actually did something that I remember when we were going to launch it. I love to do things that, like, if someone says it's probably going to fail or it's a bad idea, I know I'm probably on the right track because we've never tried it before. And so we hosted a panel. We'll call it a panel, but I kind of joked when we started it. We were like making it like the Real World, like the MTV TV show. But we took our framework and we used a visible thinking routine, which was connect, extend, challenge. So how does this connect to your current practice? How does this extend your current practice? And what challenges are you running into? So we realized that on all of these days, the building of expertise was usually by someone with a lot of expertise leading the conversation. And it was creating this dichotomy that was intimidating for people. So we pulled members of the committee that did not want to be in front of the group, did not feel totally confident or like they should be the one to be talking about their practice. And we actually had them take our assessment framework and then do a live Connect Extend challenge. And I just started the podcast, so I was feeling pretty good about my interview skills. So I just live interviewed them up at the front in the big theater in front of, all of their colleagues. And they were raw and vulnerable and honest and talked about epic fails that they had had that year. And people were laughing and groaning and some were super inspired. They tell a story about something that worked really well that they weren't expecting. And that was a really powerful day too. The actual experience of hearing other people say, I've tried and it didn't go as perfectly as I was hoping, but here's one nugget of something that I was really excited about. That for me was a great way to get people to a point where they were like, I want to build this expertise now. I want to get in. And because I think the greatest expertise comes by doing. I think we can talk and talk and talk and we can read things. And I think that's all well and good. I love hearing about book clubs going on in schools and things like that. But until you actually get in there and take action with some of these ideas, you'll never have that tacit knowledge. And for me, that's like when I hear the word expertise, that's what I think of is I've actually lived this. And I have that like personal narrative and story that it works in a way that works for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Being intentional, being purposeful, and leaving nothing to chance, I think is important, that you are intentional about building the capacity and expanding your expertise within the school. Listeners, don't forget, we will at some point, of course, have Natalie back on the show. But at this point, I want to remind you to subscribe to Natalie's podcast called EduCrush. I think new episodes will be coming out shortly. I believe Natalie was recording a trailer for episode or season 3 coming out. I think I saw some Instagram posts about that. So listeners, don't forget to subscribe and follow Natalie on social media. We'll have, of course, the links have been in the show notes all summer. So make sure you follow that. What else is going on, Nat? What, anything you want to talk about, promote, anything you want to let listeners know about that's happening with you?
Yeah, as you know, I left my full-time school-based job in the spring. And so I have a lot of things on the go. I'm starting work with yourself and some other brilliant colleagues at Solution Tree and have a couple really exciting collaborations coming up with different schools and school districts. But something I wanted to take some time to talk about here, because it's a passion project of mine that I think has been brewing since I was a little kid, because I've always loved building things, creating things. I have a little bit of an entrepreneurial spirit, I guess, is a way to describe that. But this October, I am launching an online program called the Empowerment Ecosystem. And I've really followed a design thinking process to get to this point. So we're really at that prototyping point. To go through the empathy phase, I talked to 50 people across the world, Australia, Africa, the UK, Ireland, the States, Canada, and tried to gain empathy for folks who consider themselves to be change agents in this space between assessment and grading and equity. And so based on what I learned, people really want community. They really want transformation. And I've grounded that learning into what is now this prototype program. So we're going to launch with just 10 people. I'm going to work side by side with them, go really deep. And hopefully we are going to get to the outcome of truly empowering students with assessment and becoming those inspiring mentors that we want to be for our colleagues who are seeking us out and want to change and break that through that pain point that exists for all of us, that can sometimes be a little lonely or isolating when you're someone who's really fired up about assessment or grading or equity or all three, and you're talking about these ideas and people are rolling their eyes and saying, oh, that would never work for my students, or, oh, I've seen this before, the pendulum, which is what we're talking about right back at the beginning. So I want to help those individual people. I'm doing a double-pronged approach to reimagining education this fall. So I've got this program for individuals, but then the solution tree work is much more school and district based. So that's what I'm up to.
Right. So how can listeners connect to that online program? How do they connect with you?
Well, I would love to meet them first and foremost for a talk, likely through Zoom. Okay. I'll give you a link that you can include in your show notes if you don't mind.
Okay.
And I'd love to just chat with them and see if it's a good fit for their goals. And if it is, we'll go from there.
Fantastic. Okay. So this is it for Assess That with Tom and Nat over the summer. But of course, we'll have Natalie back periodically if topics arise or things we want to debate, or maybe Natalie just wants to rant about something assessment-wise. We'll go from there. I think I'm the one that does more ranting than Natalie does. So as the expression goes, this is not goodbye. It's see you later. And we'll have Natalie back at some point. But again, Nat, thanks for being here every other week over the summer. It's been great to sort of dig into some of these topics. And I know some of the feedback I've received from listeners is they've very much appreciated you bring your perspective, some of your practical experience, and of course, your expertise that you brought to the conversation. So, all right, we'll see you again at some point. But that's it for now. Assess That with Tom and Nat. That's a wrap. Okay, that's it for this week. Remember to follow the podcast on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. Also, please email the podcast, tomshimmerpod@gmail.com, if you have questions for Assessment Corner or any suggestions you have or feedback you have for the podcast. And a reminder to check the show notes for the links for the upcoming professional learning events this fall. The next episode will be Monday, September 12th in 2 weeks. Then hopefully we'll be back to our weekly schedule as September unfolds, but we'll have to see how that goes as my travel schedule and book editing is about to be cranking up this fall. So we'll see. The goal is to go every week, but we'll see how that plays out. Please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, especially on Apple Podcasts, but of course a rating or review on any platform will help grow the podcast reach. And if you like what you hear, please keep spreading the word about the podcast to your friends, your colleagues, or on social media. I would really appreciate that. Have a great week, everyone.